Welcome to TORAH Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Rabbi Michael Skobac coming to you from beautiful Canada. Rabbi, how are you, sir?
Okay.
Pleasure as usual, getting you back. We had a little bit of a break, didn't we? We're gonna have a big break soon. You have to tell us about your big break.
We don't. Well, we'll play it by ear.
Okay, that'll work.
Yeah, I don't like to let everybody know
Yeah.
exactly what's going on.
Right.
Let some things be a surprise.
Let's keep them guessing.
Yes, that's the name of the game. That's what's called good radio.
Hey, that is so true. Yeah, I saw something on the news today. I don't really follow sports anymore, but I just happened to catch this one clip of the news because I was walking through the room, and the news lady, she was saying they was talking to the head coach or something of the Texas Longhorns, and it says that they won't tell who this new draft pick or something or another is. And so they showed a clip of them interviewing him, and he goes, I like to keep some things a surprise. He goes, but you really want to know, don't you? so like you said, it's good television. Oh my gosh.
Keep those ratings high.
Yes, indeed. So tonight we are rocking with Acts chapter 16, and interested to see what it's all about. Last episode 15, or chapter 15 was quite interesting. And so looking forward to what you have tonight, Rabbi.
Yeah, so chapter 15 is really a critical chapter in really, I think, in developing or tracing the trajectory of the Jesus movement as it moves forward. When we went through the book of Matthew, we saw that Jesus and his movement was basically centered among Jews exclusively, and that was what Jesus actually commanded. He told his disciples when they go out to preach his message that they're not to go to the Gentiles. And one of the things that happens in the book of Acts is we see the beginning of this movement spreading, not really so much through the disciples themselves, but through Saul, who we saw becomes Saul Paul, and Paul seems to have some success in reaching. And again, he is not operating in Israel at this point. He's operating in the diaspora, in the Greco-Roman world, among essentially mainly non-Jews, and there have been non-Jews that have embraced Paul's message, and so now. What we saw last week was the first real serious challenge that was faced by this movement. It was a new question. What do we do? What do we do with these Gentiles that are coming into our movement? And it's an interesting reverse from the way things have developed, meaning that originally, if anyone told you that they believed Jesus was the Messiah, you knew one thing about them. You knew they were a Jew, if we're talking, at the time of Jesus or a few years afterwards. But once you get to the, let's say, 30 years, 40 years after the death of Jesus, into the 60s and 70s and 80s, increasingly, the Jewish movement is receding, and if you were to ask anyone, let's say in the 2nd century, who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the chances would have been that they were not Jewish. And now things are coming full circle, because now, generally speaking, 2,000 years later, anyone that you meet that claims they believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the knee-jerk reaction, the sort of the assumption is that, they must not be Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often considered to be strange when you find Jews who identify themselves as followers of Jesus. So, that's what we have now, where right now it's sort of strange to have a Jew that's coming to believe in Jesus, but originally it was strange to have a Gentile coming to faith in Jesus. And so last time we met in Acts 15, the big question was, so what do we do with these Gentiles? And there were people who were suggesting among the followers of Jesus that they need to be circumcised and to keep the Torah of Moses. That was in chapter 15, verse 5. Uh, and that made sense. Meaning that, let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say today, someone that's not Jewish comes into a Chabad house and says, I want to be a Chabad chassid. I want to be a Lubavitcher chassid. So, the answer would be, well, if you want to be part of the Lubavitch Hasidic group, you've got to become Jewish. That's sort of a prerequisite.
And your last name has to be Nick, Chabad Nick or something like that.
so that was what, there were people who said back then, look, you want to be a follower of Jesus, you want to, what you want to embrace what he was all about. Well, he was all about keeping the Torah. He was all about, the world of the Torah, the world of the covenant God made with Israel. And so there were people saying, look, any non-Jews who want in, that's fine, but they need to convert to Judaism. They need to get circumcised if they're a male, and they need to embrace all of the commandments given by Moses, which is basically the procedure of converting. And obviously, we know that Paul was, he doesn't weigh in the discussion in Acts 15, but we know from his writings that, he was not pushing his Gentile followers to, follow the commandments. We know that he taught the exact opposite. So the question is, what do we do with these non-Jews? And what is the basic punchline of Acts 15 is that James, who was the brother of Jesus, and we see, in Acts 15 that the leader, because the decision came from him, the decision was that the non-Jewish people coming into the Jesus movement, the Gentiles, they are not required to convert to Judaism, which means there's no need for them to get circumcised. There's no need for them to convert and observe all the laws of the Torah, but they do need to keep some basic laws of universal morality. And what we proposed when we analyzed this was that even though it's not 1,000% clear, James seems to tick off 3 or 4 possibly of the 7 laws of the children of Noah, the 7 Noahide laws, which according to traditional Jewish thought were the basic laws that God had already revealed to Adam, and then number 7 to Noah. The 7th one to Noah was that you cannot eat the limb of a living creature because Adam wasn't allowed to eat any meat. So Adam would have had 6 of the 7 of these basic laws of morality. And when they came out of Noah's Ark and were given permission to eat meat, so now the one restriction was that the animal had to be totally dead. They couldn't eat a limb from a living creature. Now, whether or not that's all there is to it, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about whether these are just 7 simple commandments or they're really more general, in which there are some subsidiaries of each of these 7, and they may number more like 70. That's not necessary for us to get into, but it seems, at least the way I understood the passage, is that the decision rendered by James and accepted by everyone was that they will not require Gentiles to convert to Judaism, but simply that they be observant of the Noahide laws. And this would have been a decision very much in line with traditional Judaism, meaning the traditional Judaism would say to any Gentile who approaches and wants to join, the default answer would be, realize that you don't have to become a Jew in order to have a relationship with God. And the basic advice would be to observe the Noahide laws. And only if the person persisted and said, no, I want to, observe everything. I want to join the Jewish people. I want to be a Jew. Then the person has to go through a full conversion, which includes circumcision for men at least, and then the observance of all 613 commandments.
Question for you: in one of the Old Testament in the Hebrew Scriptures, it talks about. I think it was in either in Esther or something like that, where it says many of the people became Jewish out of their
Right.
fear for Hashem or whatever. Where was that at? Do you remember roughly? Do you remember what book that was in?
It's in Esther.
It is in
I
Esther.
think I
Okay.
think it's in the,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, the eighth chapter, I
Hmm.
believe. I can look it up as we're speaking.
The reason
But yeah, and the
why.
word that's interesting there, by the way,
Uh huh.
is the word misyahadim. They became Jews. And you know, we know that originally not all of Abraham's descendants were called Jews,
Right.
right?
Right.
They would have been originally, the name would have probably more correctly have been Israelites.
Okay.
Um, but we know that by the time of the book of Esther, the 10 northern tribes had already been exiled, and they were the 10 tribes that were comprised, they were called the Kingdom of Israel, or sometimes they were called Ephraim or Yosef. There were a number of terms for the 10 northern tribes. Um, and the remaining people of the Israelites were the two southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Judah was much, much larger. And so the name that was given to anyone at that point would have been um, Judah. And so sort of the name that stuck for people who came from the descendants of Abraham at a certain point in history, they were called Jews. Um, Even though not everyone is necessarily from the tribe of Judah, um, that's the term that was now used for everyone. So, as a matter of fact, I think um, they refer to, right, Esther earlier in the book. She didn't reveal the fact that she was a Jew. I think it specifically says that. And I think it's in chapter 8. I may be wrong. Yes, chapter 8, verse 17, the very last verse in chapter 8, it says, "In every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had a joy and gladness and feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because of the fear of the Jews that fell upon them." That's a little bit of a dicey question altogether, meaning that um, it's not considered a legitimate reason for conversion that you're afraid of the Jews. As
Right.
a matter
Right.
of fact, what's interesting is that according to Jewish teaching, that would we say that when the Messianic age begins, we won't accept converts anymore because everyone's going to want to get on the this, get on the good side of the Jewish people. It'll be too, tempting to want to join in with the people of Israel when, they've been elevated in the eyes of the whole world. So that's a time when we're not going to assume people are sincere. So it's not so simple to understand why these people would have been accepted as converts if the only reason was they feared the Jews. Now, it could be that the better translation there would be they were in awe of the Jews, not that they were fearful of the Jews.
Right. Right.
But if they were in awe of the Jews, meaning they respected the Jewish people, and they were drawn to what the Jews represented, that might have been a more legitimate reason for converting. But Acts 15 basically takes us to this point where the leaders of the Jesus movement, which is basically now James as the brother of Jesus, we know that he led the movement for 30 years until he himself was killed. Um, so that's his decision. And the other thing we mentioned last time we met was that the author of Acts tries very hard to give the impression that, Paul and the apostles are all one happy family. They're all working together. Paul is very happy to put himself at the, authority, under the authority of the disciples. And we see when we get to the book of Galatians, especially, that he didn't respect the disciples, and he didn't even respect their decision. Um, but it would look terrible if what happened is there was the Jesus group, and Paul strikes out on his own and starts his own movement among Gentiles and has no relationship to the original Jesus movement because it would look like he's starting his own religion, and there's a discontinuity between Jesus and the disciples and Paul. So the author of Acts labors really to try to patch everything up to make it seem as if it's a very neat and smooth transition between Jesus and the disciples and Paul and his mission to the Gentiles. And so it smooths over some of the hostility and tension that we will see in the writings of Paul himself. Again, because Acts is written by Luke probably in the 80s. Paul is writing his letters closer to when the events happened in the 60s and the 50s and 60s. So, it's a very, very important thing to always bear in mind when we're going through the book of Acts is to think about the agenda of Luke, who's writing this book. So, what happens this week in chapter 16 is almost a continuation of the circumcision issue, because we're told that there was someone who joined up with Paul and Silas. His name is Timothy. And we're told that Timothy was the son of a Jewish woman who believed, meaning she was a follower of Jesus, but that his father was Greek. His father was not Jewish. So this is a mixed marriage where the mother of the mother of Timothy is Jewish, but the father is not Jewish. And the question is, so what is Timothy? What do you do when one parent is a Jew, one parent is a non-Jew? We know from the scriptures, from the Hebrew scriptures, that tribal affiliation is determined by the father's tribe. If you go back to the book of Numbers, for example, in the first chapter of Numbers, throughout the chapter, it says, Lemishbechotam lebeit avotam, that the tribal affiliation is according to their families, according to their fathers' houses. So in the times of when they had tribes, if a man from tribe A married a woman from tribe B, the kids would be A's. They would not be B's. They'd follow the tribal status of the father. That's not the case when it comes to personal status in terms of whether you're a Jew or not a Jew. And that's often confusing to people. So again, when it comes to which tribe you are, if your parents are both Jewish, it follows the father. But when it comes to whether you're a Jew or a non-Jew, when the parents are not both Jewish, then we know that it follows the mother. And it's interesting that the book of Acts clearly seems to follow this point of view. It's not so strange. People often think that it's a rabbinic innovation, that it was the rabbis that invented this idea that the status in terms of religion follows the mother and not the father, but it's actually rooted in the Bible itself. If you go to the book of Ezra, chapter 10, so what was happening in the time of Ezra was that the people who were in the exile that first went to Babylon, when the Babylonians destroyed the temple, and many, almost all the Jews went into exile into Babylon. So we know that Babylon was eventually conquered by Persia, but when they came back to Israel, so we were told that many of the Jewish men had Babylonian wives, non-Jewish wives. So the question is, what's going to happen with these non-Jewish wives and also with the children? So what it says in the book of Ezra, chapter 10, is that the non-Jewish wives would be sent back to Babylon or Persia, but they'd go back to where they came from with the children. Now, what you see from this is that the status of the children is clearly that they're non-Jews, since the mother was not Jewish. Because had the children been Jewish, right, meaning if we assumed that the children follow the father's religion, right? So if these were Jewish men who married non-Jewish women, and if their children were Jewish, why would they send Jewish children back to Babylon with these non-Jewish women? Why would they let, their children that are Jewish go, and certainly to be raised in a non-Jewish environment? So it's very clear from here, this chapter in Ezra, that since you're sending the children back, the children of these non-Jewish mothers, the children are obviously also not Jewish. And if you look there in the 3rd chapter of Ezra, it says that when you do this, you will be following the Torah. It doesn't say you'll be following the legislation of the rabbis. It says you'll be following according to the Torah. It actually uses that word. So you see here that it was a Torah law, Torah rule, that the status of an individual goes after the mother in terms of whether they're Jewish or not after the father. So Timothy's mother is Jewish. He's Jewish. The only question is, why wasn't he circumcised? Because what happens in this passage is that Paul ends up circumcising him. And the question is, well, why wasn't this young man? He's probably not 4 years old in this story. He's probably, late teens, 19, 20, 21, in his 20s. Why is he now a young man and he's not yet circumcised? So there are many, many theories that have been offered for why Timothy had never been circumcised yet. One is that, well, his father was not Jewish, and maybe the father prohibited, maybe the father forbade the mother from circumcising her child. That's one possibility. Don't forget, they're not living in Israel. They're living in, a country outside of Israel where the majority of the people were not Jewish. So that's one possibility. It seems to be the most reasonable. Another possibility is that maybe the father didn't care, but maybe his mom was an assimilated Jew who herself no longer cared to be Torah observant. Maybe that's a possibility. That it wasn't that the father was a mean person that forbade Timothy from being circumcised. It could be that the mother just didn't care about it. A third possibility, which I don't accept, but I've seen brought up in some commentaries, is that because there are, well, I shouldn't say believe it or not, there are people who take a very, very different view of Jesus than I've been taking so far. There are people who believe that Jesus was not teaching and that the Torah is still obligatory. There are people who believe that the message of Jesus was that the Torah was now being abolished. And so there are people who say that's why Timothy's mother did not get him circumcised, because as a follower of Jesus, we're told that she's a woman who believed, she no longer believed in circumcision. So that's actually offered by people. I just, for all the reasons I've mentioned back in our studies of Matthew, I just simply don't buy it. I think it's just a very, very difficult position to take. But the question is, and I think this is really what I wanted to focus on tonight. So why is he now being circumcised? What is the reason? And what's interesting is what it doesn't say. It says, Paul in verse 3, Paul wanted to have him go on with him. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany them on their ministries, on their missions. And so he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. So what it says here is that because everyone knew that Timothy's father was not Jewish, the reason that Paul has him circumcised is basically because of the Jews who were living in that region. We'll try to understand what that means in a minute. But what it doesn't say is that Paul had him circumcised because that's the Torah's law, because that's what's obligatory. Meaning that even if this was not the case, even let's say if there were no Jews, right? Let's say they were living in a place where Timothy was the only Jew. So Paul really should have said, look, you're a Jew, and the Torah requires Jews to get circumcised. So it should have said that Paul insisted that Timothy be circumcised because that's the Torah law. It doesn't say this. It doesn't say that Paul's reasoning was to fulfill the commandment of God. It says it was because of the Jews who were in that region. Now, what does that mean? So I did a bit of homework here, and I just want to share. I hope you'll bear with me.
Sure.
I have about 6 commentaries that I wanted to share. Um, the first one is from a Catholic study Bible called the Ignatius Study Bible, and this is what it says. Paul circumcised him so that their joint ministry among the Jews would not be hindered by scandal. That's the reason, because, again, the verse says that he circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region. So what the Ignatius Study Bible says is, so that their joint ministry among these Jews would not be hindered by scandal. Right? Among Jews, it would be scandalous that a person that was Jewish was not circumcised. And the commentary here just references, it has as a little note here, 1 Corinthians 9:20. Now, we should turn there for a moment because, believe it or not, it's cited in many of the commentaries to this passage. 1 Corinthians 9:20, Paul says the following. I'm going to read actually in verse 19.
Okay.
Paul says in verse 19, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." And so he says in verse 20, "And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. And to those who are without the law, I become as one without the law." And he says in parentheses, not being without the law toward God, but under the law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I become as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Very, very famous passage in 1 Corinthians, where Paul basically says here that in order to win the Jews, he becomes as a Jew. And this commentary, the Ignatius Study Bible, says that was Paul's rationale. That was his motivation for having Timothy circumcised. That because he would be ministering among Jews, it would be important to be like a Jew, to present as a Jew. And again, I think what's important is that it becomes a very pragmatic rationale for circumcising Timothy, meaning that it's a circumcision with an agenda, meaning that it's in order that we can be more effective in our witness to the Jews, not because this is something that the Torah would command. The Apologetic Study Bible, which is not a Catholic, it's a Protestant study Bible called the Apologetics Study Bible, says, again, based on 1 Corinthians 9:20, which we just read, this commentary says, Paul had Timothy circumcised for the sake of a contextualized witness to Jews. You know, in modern Christian seminaries, when they talk about groups like Jews for Jesus or Messianic Judaism, they call it cross-cultural communication or the contextualization of the gospel, meaning they're talking about really dressing up the Christian message in a way that's more palatable to the audience. It's really a tactic. It's a tactic in order to make the witness more effective. And that's what he's saying here in the Apologetic Study Bible. Then from the IVP, Bible Background Commentary, it says that Paul circumcised Timothy for the sake of his witness to the Jewish community. Right? They're all basically saying the same thing here. The New King James Version Study Bible says, if not circumcised, if Timothy had not been circumcised, it would limit his effectiveness in ministering to Jewish Christians. He became circumcised so that God could use him to reach all people, even the Jews, with the message of the gospel. again, so far, all of these commentaries are saying the same thing, that the reason for circumcising Timothy was pragmatic. It was a tactic to make his ministry to share the gospel with Jews more effective. And finally, the NLT, New Living Translation Study Bible, says the following. Timothy was circumcised to enhance Timothy's acceptance and effectiveness as a Jew in Jewish circles. And now he goes on to say something important. Elsewhere, Paul clarified that it makes no difference to God whether we are circumcised or not. And he references Romans chapter 2, verses 25 to 29, Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, and Galatians chapter 6, verse 15. And the commentary goes on to say that Paul was prepared to use any legitimate means to communicate the good news. And again, this commentary references 1 Corinthians 9:20 to various audiences. So far I've shared 5 commentaries, both Catholic and Protestant, that all essentially say the same thing, that the decision to circumcise Timothy was not to fulfill the commandment of God in the Bible, but it was to make their effectiveness in witnessing to Jews and sharing the gospel more effective. I just want to share a story that happened to me recently. I was told that to one of my YouTube videos that came out recently, I think it was the one that was called the Flow, F-L-O-W, where I mentioned that we see many serious Bible-believing Christians today that are being drawn towards the Torah and towards Judaism, but we don't really see many serious Torah Jews that are embracing Christianity, and that the flow is going in one way and not the other. So one of the people commented to this video that he happens to know a Jewish rabbi that converted to Christianity. And so I did a little bit of poking around, and I found out that this rabbi, today's name, you can look this up if you want, it's interesting, Reverend Pastor Chad Foster, F-O-S-T-E-R. And I believe today he's some kind of a pastor in a I think Episcopalian church, if I'm not mistaken. And there is a YouTube video where he is being introduced to the church. They have a, meeting Reverend Pastor Chad Foster. He's not hard to find. And he's asked, by the head of the church to share his story and to share about himself. And at one point they ask him, if people from the church are going to invite you over to their homes for dinner, would you eat the food in their homes? And he basically says that he'd prefer that they not serve barbecued pork or ham or pork, but that they serve beef brisket. Not that that's kosher, but at least it's not as terribly non-kosher. And he goes on to say very specifically, that's what's so amazing. He says that he doesn't believe that he's required to keep any of these laws. And he overtly says that he's doing it to be able to effectively share the gospel with Jewish people. That the reason that he maintains some Jewish practices, I'm pretty sure he doesn't cite 1 Corinthians 9:20, but he basically gives you a textbook case of explaining the sentiments behind 1 Corinthians 9:20. He basically says that to among Jews, he wants to have a Jewish appearance so that he can more effectively share the gospel. So it's not just a passage in the book of Acts that and in the 1 Corinthians that was written 1900 years ago. We're talking about a approach towards Christian witness towards the Jewish people that still exists very much today. And of course, many modern day Christian mission organizations, the Jews, they actually speak very overtly about 1 Corinthians 9:20. Now, the last thing I wanted to share on this verse was something that I found amusing. David Stern, in his commentary, we know that David Stern is a famous Messianic Jew living in Israel now, originally from Los Angeles, and he has a very, very, uh, comprehensive commentary he wrote to the New Testament. And he's obviously, I mean, it comes through very clearly, very bothered by this passage. And he does somersaults to avoid all of the approaches that are taken by the commentaries I just cited. It really rubs him the wrong way to be able to say about Paul that he's being, manipulative, or he's being less than forthright, or that he's being sneaky, or that he's being disingenuous. He's just, you could see that it grates at him. It bothers him that Paul is open here to this accusation that he's not really being sincere in his circumcision of Timothy. It's just simply a device. It's a tactic. But he, squirm as he may, he doesn't really offer anything better. This is what he ends up saying. He says, he didn't want Timothy's uncircumcision to provoke questioning that would impede the gospel. He says, a good proclaimer of the gospel will remove any stumbling blocks they can. So, in my humble opinion, even though he really, in the passage, he has a whole, he disavows the whole attack that Paul was being manipulative here, or less than sincere and disingenuous. But I believe he ends up saying exactly the same thing, that Paul is circumcising Timothy not because it's the commandment of God, but in order to remove any impediments to sharing the gospel. So I found this passage fascinating, and believe it or not, it's the most interesting thing in this chapter, because there isn't much more for us to talk about. But we'll do what we can.
Okay.
In the next passage begins in verse 6. And what comes up here is interesting. When you get to verse 10, it says as follows: Now, after he had seen this vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now, what happened is that, Paul and his group wanted to go to preach in certain parts of Asia, but they apparently were told by the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, not to go. And then it says in verse 9 that a vision appeared to Paul in the night, where a man in Macedonia stood up and pleaded with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." So Paul took this as a sign that they were now to go to Macedonia to preach. But all of a sudden, the whole tone of the narrative switches, where Luke seems to be saying we. He sort of inserts himself into the story. Now, up until now, this is chapter 16. Up until now, Paul was just writing really as an observer, allegedly. I'm not even sure if he could have been an observer. How he got this information is another question entirely. But Paul here seems to give the impression that he is part of the group. And this will come up again in chapters 20, 21, and 27 to 28. In these 4 chapters, we see in chapter 16, and then again in chapter 20, 21, and then 27 to 28, Luke writes as if he's part of the ongoings. He's part of what's taking place. Now, this is debated among scholars. Some scholars say that he may not have been there at all, and it was just a literary device, just a way of writing that was more colorful. And the more conservative Christian scholars say no, that Luke was actually part of these stories. But to me, it's a little bit strange that he'd be popping in and out of the stories like this, and no real explanation is given for why he's there in chapter 16 but not in chapter 14, or why he's not there in chapter 19. Now, when they come to Philippi, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, they meet with a woman named Lydia. This is in verse 14. A certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was the seller of purple from the city of Thyatira. Thyatira. My Greek is not that good. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I'm sure that, when I laugh at, Christians who mispronounce Hebrew words in the Jewish Bible, I'm sure that I'm being laughed at by people who are more familiar with the pronunciation of the Greek. In any event, this woman who was a seller of purple also worshiped God. And it said, the Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And in verse 15, when she and her household were baptized, so apparently she was converted by Paul, she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And so she persuaded us. This is Luke speaking, and Luke's obviously speaking about himself and Paul and Silas and Timothy. My question, I'm just asking this, I wonder, when these Jewish men came to the house of this non-Jewish woman and they stayed at her house, did they eat any of her food?
Right.
We're not told.
Right.
I can imagine, Paul looking at all the food and saying, I don't know, was that cooked in kosher pots and kosher dishes? What's that meat that's cooking on your stove? So I don't know if Paul had any interest in knowing whether the food was kosher, whether, Silas did, whether Timothy did. It's not clear to me what was Paul's attitude towards this food that was being served, or did he just say, you know what, I ate already, I'm not going to eat for the next 3 days. I'm not sure how long he stayed there, but it's an interesting question. It's going to come up again in a minute. So what happens in verse 28, 25, I'm skipping, is that I'm sorry, let me fill in the story here.
Okay.
So there was a certain slave girl they met who had a spirit of divination. She was able to divine certain things, and she was a fortune teller. We're told that the girl followed Paul, this is verse 17, and us. So again, Luke is speaking. The girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, these men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaimed to us the way of salvation, and this she did for many days. And we're told that Paul was greatly annoyed and turned and said to the spirit, because she's obviously speaking somehow in the name of a spirit, I command you, Paul says, in the name of Jesus Christ, to come out of her. So Paul is going to cast out this spirit from this woman, and he comes out that very hour. The spirit comes out. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, I guess now that she didn't have the spirit anymore, she couldn't do her fortune telling, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And they brought them in verse 20 to the magistrates and said, these men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city. Right? They're telling us what to do. They're getting in the way. They're making trouble. And so they're thrown into jail. So in verse 25, we're told that at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly we're told in verse 26, there was a great earthquake, so the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awaking from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, he supposed the prisoners had fled. So he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, because he probably figured if all the prisoners, skip town, he's going to be there, holding the bag, and he might just as well kill himself, because the authorities would kill him for not doing his job. But Paul called out in a loud voice in verse 28, saying, do yourself no harm, for we're all here. We're still here in jail. So in verse 29, then he called for a light, and he ran in, and he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas, and he brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? It's a pretty strange question, almost a non sequitur. Why is this jailer asking them what he must do to be saved? And more importantly, what did he mean by this question? I mean, what was his question really all about? From his point of view, what did it mean to be saved? Right? Did he have a similar definition of salvation that contemporary Christians have today? Um, was he saying, what do I need to do to be saved from, my bosses who might kill me for, not doing my job properly? Does it mean, what do I need to be saved from going to hell? What do I need to be saved from my sins? It's not 100% clear what his meaning was when he says this. Um, I would, as a skeptic here, I would say that he may not have asked a question like this. He may have asked something more neutral, but that when Luke writes the story up,
Right, right, right.
right, he frames it in a very Christian way. I don't think that it's the kind of thing that he would have said. I don't think he even knew about salvation from a Christian point of view. So what Luke does is to put this question in his mouth: what do I need to do to be saved? And they said in verse 31, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household.
You,
Now, yeah,
26 really stands for me. I never thought about this again until you mentioned this whole idea. What could he have possibly meant? And the whole idea of, and suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of prisons were shaken. And I can imagine this guy, like you said, maybe he didn't say that sentence. Maybe he's like, really scared for his life. And he's like, man, how do I get out of here? What can I do to save myself? You know?
maybe.
So
Because
it's very
again,
possible.
yeah, in Hebrew, the word save always means, to be saved physically from danger.
Right.
But I think that, again, I think that the writer of Luke, of Acts, I think the writer didn't mean it like that. I think that Luke does mean it in a very, very Christian kind of way, in the kind of way that Paul would speak about, right? That salvation has to do with, being rescued from your sins and achieving eternal life through faith in Jesus. And so, somehow what the author of Acts does is to give the impression that this is what was on the jailer's mind. He's asking these men. Now, it could be he was asking a similar question. He might have been just saying, what do I need to do to go to heaven? Maybe he wasn't thinking necessarily about, how do I atone for my sins? How do I? Because he probably realized these were religious men. He heard them singing and praying. So I just don't think that when he speaks about what do I need to do to be saved, he was as familiar with the meaning of that word as a Christian today might be. And so they tell him the formula for salvation is to believe in Jesus and you'll be saved, you and your household. Now, the question I have again is, what did they mean when they said back to him that you need to believe in Jesus? What does it mean to believe in Jesus? Believe what? Believe that he existed? Believe that he is the Messiah? Believe that he is God? Believe that he's the sin bearer? See, it's not spelled out. What exactly does it mean when they say to him, look, buddy, you need to believe in Jesus? If you go through David Stern's commentary, David Stern insists here that belief in Jesus is not only, the belief that Jesus is the Son of God who died for your sins, etc., but belief would include, according to David Stern, that I believe that I have to go out and share the good news with others, and I believe that I have to live, a life that is, in line with the teachings of Jesus. I mean, he gives 5 different things that are required for a person to, be saved. So, that is even reading more into the passage than I think would be normal. But it's not really clear when they say to this jailer that you need to believe in Jesus, and you and your family will be saved. And also, it's interesting that when the young prince came to Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 19 and basically asked a similar question, what do I need to do to have eternal life? Jesus didn't say, believe in me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
So
Jesus
keep the
says,
commandments, right?
why do you call me good? There's only one good, and that's God. And if you want eternal life, keep the commandments. So it's interesting that what Paul here is teaching, whatever he means, and again, I'm just raising the question, it's not eminently clear what Paul means at this point. by saying, believe in Jesus. We think we know what it means because we know today what Christians have in mind when they say believe in Jesus, right? But back then, it's not really clear. And it seems to me that whatever it means, they're not giving the kind of answer that Jesus would have given. And then again, what's interesting, in verse 34, we're told that when this jailer brought them into his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all his household. The previous story with Lydia, we're not told that she served them food. We assume that she served food because she had them stay at her house, and apparently it wasn't just overnight. But here it specifically says that he set food before them, but we're not told whether he ate the food. And there's one more question that comes up in this chapter, is that it says that he and all of his household, all of his family were baptized in verse 33. So, this plays into this very, very long-standing debate in Christian circles about infant baptism, meaning that, there are Christians who believe that infants can be baptized, and there are many Christians who believe that, you don't baptize someone that has no consciousness or no, volition.
Right.
So when it says that he and his family were baptized, did that include babies? Maybe there weren't any babies. Maybe, he only had a wife and an older son. It's not really clear what's going on here, but it would affect that, long-standing debate about whether infants are to be baptized. So that's really all I have to share. Those are all my thoughts really on this chapter. Any final things that we want to mention?
There's another verse somewhere where it has the idea of somebody supposedly was saved, and it says that him and his whole household were saved based on his own actions. I can't remember where that's at. First I was thinking it was this, but I think it was more detailed. But it really throws a different spin on what it means to be saved. Kind of like the whole Passover Easter thing. You think the idea is that everybody, if Easter was really right, or if Passover and Jesus was really right, then realistically it would only be for the firstborn son of each home, not everybody else in the home. So there's so many mixed stories throughout the Christian woven, understanding. It's quite amazing. The more we study, the more loose stones that tend to fall out of the wall. You know what I mean?
Good image.
Yeah. Right. Wow. I'll tell you what. I don't think that this episode was short of any kind of information. I think it was pretty awesome. So, Rabbi, you always knocked it out of the park once again. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Had lots of fun. See you next week. Same time, same place. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe to the website and also to the Facebook page. TORAH Talk, if you want to get the information or alerts whenever events are created or when they're modified. So, Rabbi, shalom to you. Love you much. Take care, everyone.
God bless. Good night.
Bye.
תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה